Friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to open this conference, a virtual conference with real people, the first we've had for quite a while, and on an important topic. The FW de Klerk Foundation decided to arrange this conference to consider the principles that should guide South Africa's foreign policy. Should our foreign policy be based on the values in the Constitution? To what extent should we consider old loyalties and friendships? Or should foreign policy be based on a pragmatic assessment of South Africa's perceived national interests? If foreign policy should be determined by a combination of these factors, what weighting should be given to them? We are considering this question against the background of the present war in Ukraine and the policy of neutrality that our government has adopted. We regard the Ukraine war as being of particular importance to South Africa's foreign policy because of its core significance for the conduct of international relations in the present era. The war is, perhaps, the most critical development in the international arena since the disintegration of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s, an event with which it is inextricably linked. The war demands our attention for a number of reasons. Firstly, it is a dramatic departure from the world order that we had hoped had emerged after the Second World War, and that rested on international law and the proposition that no nation should invade another nation, particularly with a view to seizing territory. Indeed, there have been very few such wars in recent decades, which, despite the conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, have been among the most peaceful in human history. Secondly, the outcome of the invasion of Ukraine is dangerously open-ended and unpredictable. There is a serious possibility that the conflict might escalate, that NATO might eventually be faced with the prospect of either having to increase its involvement in the war or face the very unpalatable consequences of a Russian victory. And if Russian aggression against Ukraine succeeds, would President Putin not be tempted to attack the Baltic states and other former components of the old Soviet Union? Finally, there is the threat of nuclear weapons. The stability that characterized the nuclear standoff between the West and the Soviet Union may no longer exist. Russia has not hesitated to flex its nuclear muscles in warning NATO not to become involved in the conflict. It apparently has a nuclear doctrine of escalating to de-escalate. We must remember that Russia, apart from its land-based missiles, has 10 nuclear submarines with 160 missiles and 1,600 independently targeted warheads, quite enough to destroy civilization. So, in our opinion, the war in Ukraine is by far the world's most serious international issue. It has upended the world order based on international law and the peaceful resolution of disputes. It holds within it disturbing possibilities for escalation and raises once again the terrible specter of nuclear conflict. South Africa's response to the war is accordingly of more than passing interest. Our speakers today will deal with this critically important question. Advocate Mark Oppenheimer will address the need for South Africa's foreign policy to reflect the values in our Constitution. Elizabeth Sideropoulos, the CEO of the South African Institute of International Affairs, will speak about the pragmatic factors that should guide our foreign policy. And Professor Irina Filatova, who will join us via Zoom, who probably knows more about the current developments in Russia and Ukraine than most people, anybody in this country, will give us her views on the Ukraine war. Their addresses will be followed by a panel discussion that will be chaired by Professor Lucky Matabula, head of the Think Foundation, who is also a member of the Foundation's Board of Trustees. I would like to thank once again the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation for co-hosting this event. The Konrad-Adenauer Foundation has played a very significant role in recent decades in promoting the debate in South Africa on critically important issues confronting our young and vulnerable constitutional democracy. I would like to invite Nancy Msibi, project manager of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation, to say a few words of welcome.
I welcome you on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. The Konrad-Adenauer Foundation stands for the principles of freedom, justice, and solidarity. Germany has shown solidarity with the people of South Africa in their fight for human dignity for time immemorial. Germany assisted South Africa during the transition to democracy and the drafting of the Constitution by, amongst others, sending legal experts to assist. As a result, the South African Constitution contains elements of the German Constitution. We all know that the South African Constitution is one of the most internationally acclaimed constitutions in the world, with its principles of liberty, equality, and democracy. How does the Constitution fare on domestic policy? The lived experience of the majority of South Africans is one of poverty and deprivation. South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, ranking first among 164 countries in the World Bank's Global Poverty Database. The government introduced the Social Relief of Distress Grant in 2020 during the hard lockdown. This was a good initiative. However, recently, the media reported that there was a delay to pay the 10.6 million people who applied to receive the new round of the Social Relief of Distress Grant from 1st April. The Bill of Rights, Chapter 2 of our Constitution, clearly stipulates that everyone has a right to have access to sufficient food, water, and social security, including appropriate social assistance if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents. Indeed, our Constitution is great, but how does the Constitution help the poor families who rely on the Social Relief of Distress Grant if their funds are not paid timelessly? So, if our government fails to deliver on bread and butter issues, how can we expect it to fare better on foreign relations? The world watched in horror when Russia invaded Ukraine in February. We expected a firm response from our government condemning Russia, but we were dismayed by their reaction. Instead of joining other world leaders in condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Cyril Ramaphosa said he preferred mediation because it will bring lasting peace. How do you mediate when innocent civilians are bombed in broad daylight? As if that wasn't enough, South Africa chose to abstain from voting on 3 UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some South Africans who supported President Ramaphosa's view asked why South Africa should get involved in Ukraine, which is so far away from us. Yet they forgot that we're in the global community. The events in Ukraine affect us all. We are now feeling the effects of the war, with rising cost of fuel, cooking oil, and other commodities. Prices matter, and principles matter even more. The weakening of the multilateral system imperils each of us if military power supersedes international law. The South African government chose to be loyal to its friend Putin, just like it continues to support single-party authoritarian Cuba. The government has spent more than 308 million to pay Cuban doctors and engineers. One may ask, do we really need doctors and engineers from Cuba while we have an unemployment rate of 34.5%? Can't we use the funds wisely and create employment opportunities for our doctors and engineers and many other professionals? Not only does the South African government fail to support the human dignity of its own people, it supports an autocratic system that diminishes the human dignity of the Cuban population. It is time that our leaders revisit the principles of the Constitution, forget all loyalties, and make decisions which are in the best interest of South Africa and the guiding principle of maximizing human dignity. A good place to start would be by condemning Putin's willful war of aggression in Ukraine. I thank you.
I'd now like to call on Advocate Mark Oppenheimer to speak to us about South Africa's foreign policy and the degree to which we should take cognizance of the constitutional values that are set out in Section 1 of the Constitution.
Well, I want to say what a wonderful pleasure it is to be here today in person. I think it's been a long time since I've given a talk to so many people that I can look in the eye. So if we start off in 1993, Nelson Mandela proclaimed that a human rights framework would be absolutely pivotal in South Africa's foreign policy. And it makes sense for the ANC to have taken this line, that encouraging other nations to use a human rights framework in condemning apartheid South Africa was a useful tool in South Africa's liberation, using international bodies like the United Nations. So I think it's in 1971 or 73, the United Nations proclaims that apartheid is a crime against humanity, that using international forums, pressure could be brought to bear on the apartheid regime to say that the abuses of people are an infringement of these fundamental human rights, and they ought to stop. And the idea was that South Africa could be a leader in some ways once the new South Africa was proclaimed, that we had a peaceful transition, that the values inscribed in our interim constitution and in our final constitution could be a light for other nations who've gone through difficult conflict. But if we fast forward to 2015, The Economist reflects on the ANC's foreign policy and describes it as clueless and immoral. And this is an extract from the beginning of the article, which says, to understand how far South Africa has strayed from Nelson Mandela's legacy, one need only peruse the latest foreign policy paper drafted by grandees of the African National Congress. The fall of the Berlin Wall, it reads, marked not the freeing of captive nations in Europe, but a regrettable triumph of Western imperialism. The pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square in China were an American-backed counter-revolution. Russia's invasion of eastern Ukraine is a conflict directed from Washington. America's policies in Africa and the Middle East have the sole intention of toppling democratic governments. And as part of the international revolutionary movement to liberate humanity from the bondage of imperialism, South Africa should seek to have American military bases thrown out of Africa. And this was rightly decried by The Economist. So you have a sense that there is this gulf between Nelson Mandela's aspirations for what South Africa would be and what is done in practice. And I think we can get a sense of how far the party has strayed by looking at a number of different examples. There's a sense in which I think these three guiding values can be used as important lenses. So the one is to say, well, how important should human rights be? And should human rights follow a global agenda, or are they the kind of things that are restricted to your nation state? How important is it to pursue your national self-interest? And the third, which I think doesn't really involve many South Africans, but involves the ANC, is how much time should you spend backing up your former allies, regardless of the horrendous things that they do? And the impression we can get from South Africa's voting record at the UN, or from public statements that it makes, and from actions that it takes, is that the majority of its view is centered towards that third consideration: what's best for the ANC, or what's a good way of keeping these ties going or paying back our old friends, to the detriment of human rights and to the detriment of pragmatic solutions for South Africa. Now, if we think about something like the Rome Statute, which South Africa signs onto quite proudly, it also codifies this notion that apartheid was a crime against humanity. It sets up the International Criminal Court, and South Africa is quite enthusiastic about this. We then later see a change. So when Omar al-Bashir comes to South Africa, and who is a wanted man by the ICC for crimes committed in Sudan, encouraging war crimes and rape, and South Africa takes this odd attitude to protecting him, so much so that litigation is brought so that Bashir will be arrested and he's instead secreted out of the country. There's a sense that South Africa says, well, we thumb our noses at these international statutes, and for a number of years took the view that South Africa should withdraw and wanted to encourage other African nations to withdraw from the ICC. For a strange purported reason, the idea that the International Criminal Court persecutes Africans by spending time prosecuting the worst offenders. It's a very strange line to have. Imagine if people said, well, you're persecuting Yugoslavians or Germans when you set up special tribunals like the Nuremberg Tribunal or the Tribunal in Yugoslavia. You'd say, no, you're fighting for the rights of the victims of those evil regimes. And so that's the purpose of an International Criminal Court, is to hold dictators and war criminals to account for the horrible crimes that they've performed against their citizens. And in many recent years, those citizens have been African. And so South Africa takes this odd stance on that front. So what are the fundamental principles in the South African Constitution that could be this light onto other nations? Well, freedom, dignity, and equality are our foundational norms. The other one that's often neglected in Section 1 of the Constitution is this value of non-racialism. And what that means is not just the prohibition on racism, but it's this more fundamental idea that when we assess each other, we do so based on the content of our characters, not the color of our skin, drawing from Martin Luther King's famous line. And this is undoubtedly a value that's important, and one that has been swiftly abandoned by the ANC domestically, and I'd say abroad as well. One of the other fundamental rights for any democracy to prosper is the right of property. And what we've seen is a sustained attack on our domestic constitutional rights to property, that the ANC has tried for many years to amend our constitution to allow the government to confiscate people's private property. Thankfully, that constitutional amendment has failed. But it also has international ramifications. One of the biggest trading partners for South Africa is the United States. And we benefit from AGOA, which provides preferential access to their markets. South Africa exports roughly 200 billion rands worth of goods to America. And if we were to erode our constitutional property rights protections, there's a very good chance that AGOA would have been cancelled for us, that we would no longer be a beneficiary of it. Furthermore, of course, it jeopardizes all of the American businesses and other European businesses who run in South Africa, that their property could very well be confiscated by the state. So our domestic concerns also play a role with regards to our international relations with other nations, and those are being jeopardized. So there's a sense here in which we can see that what's good on a pragmatic level, like fostering relations with our biggest trading partners, can also coincide with the human rights account of protecting property rights. One of the values closest to my heart and much of the work that I do is around free speech. And if we think how important this free speech right is, the ability of people with dissenting views to be able to express them without a concern that they're going to be jailed for it, if we think about the awful amounts of censorship that happened during apartheid, that it's an important value to be enshrined in our constitution, and one that's quite maximal in its protections. We have very few limitations on free speech in South Africa, one of which being hate speech. Now, in the international arena, when the United Nations had a resolution on this question about people being able to freely express their ideas and to engage in public protest of those ideas, South Africa abstained. So instead of endorsing the values that are in our constitution, South Africa decided not to endorse those values in the public arena. We were also one of the early nations to guarantee protections for the gay community. So if you look at Section 9 of our Constitution, which is the Equality Clause, it lists a number of groups which are given protection, and sexual orientation is specifically listed. We were the 5th country in the world to have gay marriage, and many other nations have followed our lead. But in the international arena, when there was a resolution to protect people from being victimized or subject to violence on the grounds of sexual orientation, instead of South Africa saying, this is an important value, this is something that we ourselves have driven, that we care about on a domestic level, and other countries ought to care about it too, again, South Africa abstains. We also see that there's a sidling up to some of the most sinister regimes in the world. So regimes that are happy to practice torture, kidnapping of people, to suppress the rights of journalists or their citizens. We could reflect the values that are in our Constitution. We have the right to dignity, we have the right to bodily integrity, which specifically talks about people not being tortured and how you have a right not to be tortured, something which should be close to the hearts of many members of the ANC who were themselves tortured during the struggle against apartheid. But we find that when the UN calls for these nations to be condemned, South Africa sits back and does nothing about it. With regards to what's in the current ANC's foreign policy document, we get a sense of where the allegiances lie. The document says that unilateral sanctions against Iran, Syria, North Korea, Nicaragua, Russia, and Venezuela, and Cuba are perfect examples of the bullying conduct that is intensifying. In other words, these poor little nations who are being bullied, these are rogue nations. These are some of the most sinister nations one can think of. That if we think about the atrocities that are committed in North Korea, that the human rights record of Iran is utterly abysmal. That if you are gay in Iran, you are subject to being pushed off a building because of it. That the actions of Russia have become more and more sinister over time, and I will speak in some detail about the current war in Ukraine. And then, of course, if we think about Venezuela, instead of condemning what the Venezuelan government has done to its own people, remember that 2.5 million people were driven into exile because of their abysmal economic policies, that people are on the Maduro diet, which is a polite way of talking about losing 30 kilos because you can't eat. A crisis that has not just affected Venezuela, but neighboring countries who've had to absorb all those people who've been driven into exile. Instead of condemning that conduct, what the ANC government does is try and emulate it by changing our constitution in a similar manner to the amendment done by Chavez, allowing the state to have this power to confiscate property. With regards to Cuba, again, a communist nation which has oppressed its people, which has one of the lowest access to internet in the world, which had a single dictator for a long period of time. The South African attitude towards it is to say, my friends, can we give you money? We know that our people are starving. We know that we can't pay our own social grants, but we'd like to give you 50 million rand. And of course, it takes an organization like AfriForum to take them to court to halt the payment of South Africa's funds to this regime. And how does the ANC regard what happened in Venezuela? Well, through a very strange lens. Again, in their policy document, they say, imperialist designs also continue to manifest in support of the right wing in Latin America. Nowhere is this felt more brutally than in Venezuela, whose economy has been wrecked through a combination of sanctions and sabotage, further deepening internal weaknesses and contradictions. This has led to a sharp rise in inflation, poverty, and hunger. So instead of confronting the reality that it's Venezuela's own domestic policy which led to the suffering, the claim is, well, it's those evil imperialists in the West who've imposed sanctions, and that's why things have gone south in Venezuela. Now, interestingly, one of the tools in the ANC's arsenal in the fight against apartheid was a call for sanctions against the apartheid regime. But now that it's in power, it has voted with Russia, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia to oppose the use of economic sanctions by one state against another. So what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander. That instead of saying there are certain principles that are important to use, that being able to coerce a state into treating its citizens with dignity, with fairness, with freedom, and that sanctions are a useful way of encouraging that, South Africa says, no, we don't support that. Closer to home, when sanctions would have been quite useful in dealing with the atrocities committed by the Mugabe regime against the citizens of Zimbabwe, South Africa adopted a quiet diplomacy approach. This idea, well, we were brothers in the liberation movement, and we shouldn't be too harsh against what you're doing to your own people. Now, if we think about, again, the erosion of property rights in Zimbabwe, it didn't just affect the farmers who lost their land. It affected all citizens. That Zimbabwe is on the record for having the world's worst case of hyperinflation. That it was cheaper to use Zimbabwean notes than to go and buy toilet paper. That 90% of people were driven into unemployment. We think our electricity situation is abysmal. In Zimbabwe, they have more time without power than with power. And of course, it's created an enormous refugee crisis. So many Zimbabweans seeking a better life fled that country and came to our country and have prospered. And of course, this has led to other tensions. So as we've entered into our own economic troubles, people are being scapegoated. And the people that are being scapegoated are often Zimbabwean. There are calls from South Africa First style parties saying that Zimbabweans must be forced to leave, that they're often persecuted. If we think about the number of xenophobic attacks that have happened in South Africa, people being burnt alive, people being tortured and killed. The South African government has been very poor about dealing with this crisis, often doesn't condemn xenophobic attacks in the right terms, and has created a climate which has often led to these divisions. So one might say, well, maybe South Africa just takes this view of saying, leave us out of it. We're just going to abstain generally. We're not going to make proclamations about what happens in other states. But that's not what we find. So there's one nation in particular who is often singled out for rebuke by the South African government. That's the nation of Israel. Not only has South Africa taken a avowedly pro-Palestinian stance, which may be defensible, it has specifically invited Hamas to come to ANC conferences. Now, for those of you who don't know, Israel is on one side has the Gaza Strip, and on the other side is the West Bank. The PLO, or the Palestinian Authority, are in the West Bank, and Hamas are in Gaza. And Hamas are widely regarded as a terrorist organization by the European Union, by America, by Australia. They are willing to specifically target civilians, launching rockets, kidnapping soldiers, are widely reviled as an organization, even by the Palestinian Authority. But the ANC government welcomed Hamas to South Africa. We'll call them friends. It would even ruin the life of a young black South African girl who won Miss South Africa, who was invited to participate in Miss World, which happened to be held in Israel. And they condemned her, and they tried to force her not to go to Israel. And she defied them. She said, this is an important thing that I want to do. And she went to Israel, and she competed in Miss World, and I think she came third. And there was a backlash against the ANC for saying, why are you taking your hatred for Israel out on this poor young girl, this girl who represents South Africa in a world forum? South Africa has downgraded its embassy with Israel. It's condemned Israel's observer status in the AU, and often out of kilter with what's been happening in the international arena with Israel. So if we think about the Abraham Accords, Israel has managed to do peace deals with many of its former adversaries to great gain for those nations. And that those nations that signed up to the Abraham Accords were often the fastest to provide vaccines during the COVID crisis. That Israel, being a small state, has incredible technological abilities. So South Africa has missed out on getting access to desalination plants, which would have been incredibly useful during the water crisis in the Western Cape, when we got very close to a day zero, and is an ongoing crisis in the Eastern Cape, where people don't have water. And so these are eschewed. So one might say, well, there's something different about Israel. This is a country that has disputed territories. Maybe the ANC just cares about occupied people, and that they would denounce that. But of course the ANC is silent on Tibet. That when Desmond Tutu invited the Dalai Lama out, someone who's regarded as a champion of peace, he was denied a visa. That when the Chinese persecute a Muslim minority of Uyghurs, again, South Africa is silent. And of course, we must then think about the current conflict, which has many ramifications for South Africa and the rest of the world. The conflict in Russia and Ukraine. Now, to her credit, Naledi Pandor came out very quickly, calling for Russian troops to be withdrawn from Ukraine. But this position was walked back. South Africa took the view that it wouldn't say something so harsh as that. The UN resolutions that were made, which South Africa abstained from, were signed up to by most nations in the world. They expressed grave concern for attacks on civilian facilities like schools and hospitals, the killing of women and children, people with disabilities. The UN recognized that the military operations in Russia inside the sovereign territory of Ukraine are on a scale that the international community has not seen in Europe in decades, and that urgent action is needed to save this generation from the scourge of war. Now, the question is, given the ANC approach to sinister regimes and sinister actions, and its deviation from a human rights policy, can any of this be explained away by saying, well, this is what's in South Africa's pragmatic interest? I don't think so. I don't think that an ongoing war in Ukraine is good for South African citizens. As Nancy mentions, it's led to massive escalations in prices, inflation around the world, surging cost in fuel, which is going to be felt by the poorest of the poor the most strenuously. Why sidle up to Russia? Well, the ANC has had a friendly relationship with the Russians during apartheid, that many figures were trained in Russia. Jacob Zuma, when he believed that he was poisoned, flew out to Russia and believed that he was cured by Russians, that when we pursued nuclear, it was with the Russians. But as a trading partner with South Africa, Russia doesn't even fall into our top 25. It's less than a fraction of a percent. So in terms of South Africans on the ground, how important is our relationship with Russia? Not very important. It's important for the ruling party's prior loyalties. And so my argument is that instead of focusing on its prior loyalties, South Africa should first care about human rights, be a light unto other nations by thinking about the important founding values in our Constitution, and that approach will in general be the pragmatic approach. It will be the approach that will be for the benefit of all South Africans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'd now like to invite Elizabeth Sirodopoulos to give her presentation. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everybody, Ambassador. It's good to be here in person, as Mark said. I think in my case, it's the second time in probably 3 weeks. So I'm getting used to it. The topic of the entire conference, and indeed the brief that I was given, I think is a very important one, and one that has stretched me, and one which, coming out of this, I think I'm going to write a little bit more on, Dave. So I feel like I've been given the task of being in an Oxford debate, where the statement is South Africa's foreign policy should be determined by pragmatism and I have to set out and prove that. I'm not quite sure I will entirely, because as any good researcher and academic does, as they say, on the one hand and on the other hand. I think I'm going to echo some of the points that Mark made in terms of pragmatism, national interest, issues of constitutional values, and so on. But I'd also like to highlight some other dimensions which I think are important when we are thinking about the way in which South Africa engages and carries out its foreign policy. But the first point I want to make is to use the opportunity, since this is also a Konrad-Adenauer Foundation co-hosted event, is to use a German word to describe the current environment we're in, which is, it's wonderful. The Germans have wonderful turns of phrase, and I think the word that they're using in the current environment is that we're undergoing a Zeitenwende, if I've got the pronunciation correct, an epochal change. And the war in Ukraine is very much that, as you alluded, Dave. A return to great power politics, a return to geopolitics, the end of, in particular, of the European security arrangements that emerged after the end of the Cold War. And the entry, although it's rather an inelegant phrase at this point, and I'm sure somebody will come up with something a little bit more elegant, the post-Cold War era. So the frameworks that we had taken as given and accepted post-1991, I think have been for some time, but I think the war in Ukraine is that tipping point moment where things are unraveling. And what has become much more apparent is that we're living in a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world. And here I'm copying from management speak and the VUCA concept, which I think the war in Ukraine and the ensuing global environment has made more acute. And this is on the back of fraying multilateralism, a paralysis that we have seen, not just in the way in which the UN Security Council operates, but in the way in which organizations like the WTO operate or not. A growing contestation of the rules and norms that have not dominated the rules-based international system. And this has been largely because of the rise of China and because of the rise of other countries in the global south. And it speaks to some of the debates that were being had in certainly in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, that said that the current liberal international order is an open one, it's an inclusive one, it's one that allows new powers to rise, and that therefore the system doesn't need to be replaced. It doesn't pose a threat to rising powers like China. And indeed other developing countries. This is a theory that Eikenberry, US academic, argued. And of course, before that, we had the end of history idea of Frank Fukuyama. What we have seen in probably the last decade is that isn't the case. That there are a lot of rules that countries in the developing world believe need to be changed. They are not fair. They do not reflect their particular interests and their particular concerns. And now that they have greater economic power and political power, their ability to contest these rules becomes stronger. And I raise all of these because these are all relevant for also understanding where South Africa is positioning itself in the broader global debate. And I think going forward, it probably will be true to say, which is why it's very volatile, uncertain, ambiguous, and complex, that whereas in the 1990s and the early 2000s, we thought the global order was going to be one that was harmonized and, we were all going to adopt universal values, is probably going to be defined in the next few decades as highly heterogeneous, where global value systems are not the word global will not be attached next to value system. I think you will find the emergence of parallel systems and value systems. And that certainly, I would argue, for countries like South Africa is a problem. But I'll come back to that later. So I've sort of sketched that because I think understanding these changes and trends is crucial in unpacking the question of pragmatism and indeed a values-based foreign policy in our discussion this morning. So I think everybody knows, Mark alluded to it, foreign policy is about advancing the national interest. But the national interest is a wonderful, very simple phrase, but highly complex and highly contested. Is it long-term foreign policy goals that are based on, economic, social, cultural, historic, constitutional characteristics, or are they defined by the government of the day? Okay, so they change. So it's not what Lord Palmerston said, which is the UK has permanent interests, not permanent friends. But here we're saying the government of the day has certain interests, and these will define the national interest. My personal view is that it should be the former rather than the latter, but sometimes these two coexist. And so while priorities of the government today are important, these should not be the only factor guiding foreign policy. And ideally, every governing party in any country should be constrained by an overarching framework. And in the case of South Africa, certainly this is our constitution, this is our values. That's the founding document of our new democracy. And values and interests may overlap, but they may not always overlap. And that's not necessarily always a bad thing. I'll come to that now, given that I have to argue about pragmatism. I think different stakeholders will view national interest differently, and consensus will vary. So I would argue that perhaps when we talk about South Africa's national interest, I hope we can agree that attracting more foreign investment to create jobs is a paramount national interest at one level, right? I suspect we will differ on the way to go about it, and I think you alluded to some of that. If you're tackling issues of property rights, your ability to attract foreign investment to create jobs is going to be seriously undermined. So it's about joining the dots as well when you look at these things. Defending territorial integrity of the country should also be something that is a non-negotiable, and I suspect everybody should agree on. Support for Cuba, on the other hand, the Western Sahara, Palestine, again, are things that are highly contested. And perhaps a different government would have a very different approach. I would argue they would. A different approach to these. So, the question is, what national interest do we derive from that? And I pose that question. I think national interest is also, it's about being able to recognize and identify the strategic trade-offs. So you can't always pursue your national interest at all costs and on every issue. And I would argue that even the US can't do that, and China can't do that. But assessing what trade-offs you're willing to make and why, and being able to assess their longer-term impact or relevance is what is important. And it's a game of chess. And I would argue that is so important if we're talking about having, and the fact is that, foreign policy, practically speaking, can't only always be about values. It has to be pragmatic, and sometimes our interests are not about advancing certain values. But we need to be able to play that long game of chess, what I could never master. I could never figure out, what my opponent was going to do 6 or 7 moves down the line. Hence, I dropped chess. But that's what we need in this current global environment. And I thought it was interesting to read, again, a lecture given by James Baker, who was Bush Senior's Secretary of State. This was a lecture he gave in March 2007, talking about pragmatic idealism. And he said, while firmly grounded in values, pragmatic idealism appreciates the complexity of the real world, a world of hard choices and painful trade-offs. This is the real world in which we must live, we must decide, and we must act. Okay. He says values are important, but they're not the only thing that you have to deal with. And fundamentally, he says, domestic support is very vital for any successful foreign policy. I would argue in the South African context, although it's probably also the case in many other countries, foreign policy is of relevance and important to a small group of people. And it becomes relevant to a much bigger group of people when we have issues, for example, like immigrants and xenophobia and so on. But in other cases, it's a much smaller group of people that we're talking about. So let's just move then and say, well, if we're talking about a pragmatic foreign policy, what are the characteristics? What are the features of such a foreign policy, and that would enable us to be really responsive and smart about our pragmatism? So, firstly, and I've already spoken to that, ability to see many moves ahead, appreciating the importance of structural shifts globally and how they are likely to impact on a country. Ability to assess the costs of trade-offs. Foreign relations does have a transactional element. Let's not ignore that. So support for one measure, and here I'm referring to a really interesting article that Nicole Fritz wrote for a volume we produced a couple of years ago. Sometimes supporting one measure that denies certain rights, where the opposition opposing it would not have changed the outcome, while leverage might allow you to leverage support for another one where rights are upheld. You need to be able in the executive, and the argument here was about the power of courts, but the executive sometimes needs to have that space to maneuver in foreign relations. Clearly not when we're talking about domesticated laws like the Rome Statute, for example, but certainly in terms of other engagements in foreign relations. It also has to have the ability to be a pragmatic problem solver. That may require keeping an open mind. And clearly this was one of the issues that came up in the discussions around Ukraine, that, well, we need to sort of not be seen to be in any camp. I'll come back to that, because we need to be able to potentially help to solve the problem. I think in the case of Zimbabwe that you mentioned, Mark, I think perhaps at one level, the way in which we responded in the early 2000s was about short-term pragmatism, thinking that if we do something too drastic, it's going to cause significant instability. So what we really want is to stabilize the political and economic situation, and then we'll figure it out. What has happened in the longer term is exactly the opposite, that at one level you can say, there hasn't been an overthrow of the government or the state, but it has not been stable. And it has had domino effects on the region and most notably on South Africa. I think we also need to have a common understanding of what values and norms are non-negotiable. What are the short and long-term implications, for example, of non-condemnation of an invasion of one country by another? Okay. What are the implications on international law and by extension on the way in which we operate and we may be affected in the global system? So I would argue, for example, that preservation of international law is in the national interest. A rules-based order, particularly for small states that do not have the ability to act unilaterally in the way that the US or Russia or China can do, a rules-based system is fundamental, and we have to protect and we have to reform it. I think we do have to recognize that we have to reform it, but that is important for us. I'm just perhaps going to run through some of the points around that we're all familiar with, I think, around the priorities and values of South Africa's foreign policy. I think we all know that the priorities have been articulated as being focused in the first instance on Africa, the second instance on the global south, the importance of multilateralism, but a multilateralism that is fairer and more equitable. Our priorities talk about the importance of political and economic relations with the North, but those are number 4 or number 5 in the list of priorities, and very much also the importance of South-South cooperation. Here I just want to pause a little bit, because we talk about values in the Constitution, which are about human rights, justice, democracy, and so on. But there are another set of values that the government identifies and recognizes, and which sometimes trump the values that are in the Constitution around human rights, etc. And these are the South-South cooperation principles, which at one level are really about reasserting developing countries in opposition to colonialism, but in another we know have become problematic because they act as shields to misgovernance and violation of rights in countries in the developing South. And what are these principles? Respect for national sovereignty, national ownership and independence, equality, non-conditionality, non-interference in domestic affairs, and mutual benefit. And I think these have been at various times brought to the fore in arguing South Africa's position in some instances and in some decisions that it has taken. I think it is fair to say that for small countries, because South Africa is a small country, our ability to operate in the world is not as open or as free and independent as it might be for superpowers. But small countries obviously also do have leverage. And there is a wonderful book that has been brought out by an Indian academic based in Germany that talks about the power of poverty narratives, where she argues about the role that less developed countries and the power that less developed countries have been able to exercise in the WTO. So small countries do have power, but we have to operate, and our interest is in a rules-based international system. There are a couple of points that in considering our pragmatic approach we need to consider. We're geographically very far from some of our most important markets. We're also a country that straddles two oceans, although that's something that we haven't really considered in a significant in terms of being able to do something about it. In order to be able to patrol, in order to be able to project influence and norms around the development of maritime issues. There is economic potential in the region, but parts of the continent are very volatile. So there are issues here about how you settle disputes in order for us to be able to maximize some of the opportunities that are critical to our national interest. There is also greater contestation of African leadership than there was in 1994. South Africa actually doesn't really have natural partners on the continent. You know, if I were to ask you, who is South Africa's great buddy on the continent, you probably wouldn't necessarily be able to tell me, these guys are firm brothers or sisters on this. And so what that means is that in the way in which we engage on a lot of issues, including on governance and democracy, there is often a balancing act that South Africa plays in where it positions itself, so as not to upset the Africa group. Because a lot of its legitimacy in the way in which it operates in the international environment, whether it is its role in the G20 or in the BRICS or whatever, actually comes from Africa. Pragmatism, I think, is essential, but it requires adeptness. It requires analytical clarity. It requires the ability to execute and articulate positions unambiguously. And I would argue that while in some cases South Africa has been quite pragmatic over the last 25, 28 years, on some of the most contested issues, the way in which we have engaged has created more problems than actually resolved. We haven't necessarily been adept. We haven't necessarily been on message. We haven't necessarily been analytically clear about what we are saying and what we want to achieve. And that has led to a great deal of ambiguity. It's always interesting to watch Indian officials from their Ministry of External Affairs in terms of how they position India and the arguments they make. And they are very, very on point and on target. And they don't deviate. They're on message. And I think if the Ukraine experience is one thing to go by, there was a lot of ambiguity. Right at the beginning, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, declared that this was the invasion was a violation of international law. There was a lot of walking back. And then again, on the 8th of April, said, we do not justify the invasion. We do not condone the invasion. But by that time, all of the talk about neutrality, of course, had, I think, flown out of the window because there was so much that was being said that touted the Russian position, that talked about this is NATO aggression. This is Europe's war. This is NATO and Russia. This is not NATO. This is not Russia and Ukraine. And that created an echo chamber of, I think, great confusion about what was our national interest in taking the position that we took. I want to highlight, and then I'm sort of coming to a close. I want to highlight a couple of points that came out of the narrative that we heard from the government as a whole during the last 3 months. The first was about South Africa has an independent and non-aligned foreign policy. Okay, we want to resist becoming in great power politics. We believe in the peaceful resolution of disputes. Okay, I think at the UNHRC, South Africa said that wars end when dialogues begin and wars endure when there is no dialogue. Okay, but were we really prepared and able, and did we really understand the context in which the Russian invasion of Ukraine took place? And I would argue we were very naive. We've spoken about a fairer and more consistent multilateral system. And there you can't really fault South Africa, okay? The multilateral system needs to be consistent in the application of a condemnation of violations of international law. And the system is not always consistent. And South Africa has spoken about sanctions and regime change. And I think you already mentioned the issue of sanctions and the aversion to sanctions, but equally the aversion to regime change. And there were echoes, unfortunately, in some of the narrative from the West about regime change in Ukraine. And that was one of the that is always a red flag for South Africa. The last point I want to make about Ukraine, values and pragmatism, is, of course, the word hypocrisy has come up often, and it has come up on the side of South Africa, talking about the inconsistency. But the point that I have made before here is that, if we were ourselves to be consistent, in the same way that we condemned the invasion of Iraq, in the same way that we subsequently condemned the way in which Libya was handled, meant that, in fact, we could have handled what happened in Ukraine in exactly the same way and actually been true both to our principles and to the pragmatism around the importance of securing the multilateral international order. In the last couple of weeks, colleagues and I have been cooperating with some colleagues in Latin America around a new concept, which we've just brought out a little book on, which is called active non-alignment, which I thought was a really interesting way of looking at the way in which developing countries engage in international relations in this current geopolitical context. It's based on a book, or the concept is elaborated in a book in Spanish, unfortunately, which is called Active Non-Alignment in Latin America, a Doctrine for the New Century. And it basically argues that as the world stumbles towards the second Cold War, developing nations realize that if they want to safeguard their autonomy, the last thing they need to do is to align themselves with either of the great powers. And they argue that it is about refusing to align automatically with one or another of the major powers. It's about putting their national interests first but critically, it is not about equating it with neutrality. Now, this concept came out before the war in Ukraine, but it is picked up in academic debates, and a little booklet has come out that covers perspectives from different parts of the global south. Is active non-alignment then, and I pose this question, a pragmatic option? For any of you who follow India's foreign policy, there's a wonderful snippet that you can get on Twitter with the Indian foreign minister, who talks about, he doesn't understand why Europe's problems must be our problems, but our problems are never Europe's problems. And he makes the point, I have my own side. Now, this is India. This is, what is it, the fifth or the sixth largest economy, 1/5 of the world's population. But this is the perspective that many countries in the global south are beginning to take. And it's a perspective that says, I don't want to take sides because I believe I can benefit and I can have good relations with the US. And in the case of India, India is part of the Quad. And at the same time, I have issues with China, okay, Doklam a couple of years ago, and territorial disputes. But I have an economic relationship with China, and I can still engage with China notwithstanding these problems, or indeed with Russia. And this is something that I think the Ukraine war has made more acute in terms of the discussions. The fact that countries do not wish to be pushed into particular positions, where they're either, it's a case of, you either favor me or you favor me. Do you love your father more than you love your mother? Kind of arrangement. Maybe that's not an entirely appropriate analogy, but nevertheless, that's the point. And this is the point, I think, that has been articulated by South Africa as well. Naledi Pandor's statements of, I think, the 8th of April, where she talks about, resisting becoming embroiled in the politics of confrontation and aggression that has been advocated by the powerful countries, and seeking to assert our independent, non-aligned views and wishing to promote peaceful resolution of conflict through dialogue and negotiation. I do believe that there are times when peaceful resolution of disputes is not a pragmatic option. And I don't think the circumstances that we had to, that we are now, most of us are very familiar with the war in Ukraine, actually allow that to happen. But that is the position that they're taking. And many developing countries are taking that position because they also feel that on many of the issues that they feel very passionately about, the West in particular, and I think we need to understand that this is also seen as not just an invasion of Russia, by Russia of Ukraine, but that this is actually a war between Russia and the West, that on many of the points that are important for developing countries, the West either sort of drags its feet or says that this is not an issue. Whether we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about some of the debates on taxation or illicit financial flows, or on development finance, infrastructure financing, a lot of those are coming from the East. And at one level, therefore, that's a pragmatic approach for developing countries to take. Let me then end by sort of putting out some questions. Clearly, our economic national interests lie with the EU, the US, China. Russia is a very small economic player in South Africa. But there is another dimension, which is the principles of transformation of global governance, a more effective and a fairer one. But violation of international law undermines that very principle, right? So we want to push for greater reform, but at the same time, we shouldn't undermine some of the tenets of the global governance system. Has it been handled adeptly? If we believe in negotiations, if we're talking about the way in which we've engaged on Ukraine, do we understand the context and the consequences? Are we being pragmatic about our potential to problem solve, given the way that we have engaged on it? Have we been able to see ahead and down the line in terms of what this Zeitenwende vendor might mean for the global system in which we have to learn, in which we have to survive in the next, over the next decades?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Pragmatism is always much more complex in principle. We'd now like to link to Professor Irina Filatova in Cape Town via Zoom, who will talk to us about South Africa's foreign policy on the Ukraine war specifically. And by the way, more information about our speakers is available in our program.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you for inviting me. It is a very interesting discussion, and it's a great honor to participate in it. It is difficult to be the third speaker because so many things that I could or would have mentioned have already been said, have already been mentioned, and to some of them I shall have to return when I speak. It is a pity that I cannot be there with you, and it is also difficult to be just a talking head. That is why, for your entertainment, I have done a presentation which I would like to share with you. It does not exactly reflect what I'm going to speak about, but at least some instances and some pictures, bright pictures, will be there. David mentioned that what the war in Ukraine presents is an attempted change of global order. And I fully agree that this is the major characteristic of that war. So there are quite a number of things that have been mentioned already about South Africa's policy on Ukraine. And we spoke about the international law, we spoke about practicalities, but one of the things which Elizabeth mentioned was the very important significance of the domestic support and of the balancing act in choosing the policy. For South Africa, just like for any other country, the war in Ukraine mostly started in this February. And we keep forgetting that actually it started a long time ago. Ukraine was in this situation of a military conflict from 2014, and Mark has already mentioned it. What happened then was that Ukraine experienced a difficult period when there was, depending on your views, either an attempted coup or a successful coup or a revolution. In other words, the situation was very, very unclear. And the world perceived this situation as an internal Ukrainian conflict. It was, to a very large extent, it was such. But of course, the situation was different because at a very early stage, the Russians started to intervene. Zuma was at that time in Moscow. He was searching the medical assistance for his poisoning. And already on 17 days after he came there, these negotiations about nuclear deal began. There's a wonderful new book about it, which is called Nuclear by Morn and Pearson. So Zuma supported then the Russian policy in Ukraine. What did this mean? This meant that South Africa did not condemn the incorporation of the Crimea. It was calling on Russia and Ukraine to settle the crisis through dialogue. It abstained in the United Nations General Assembly vote on the territorial integrity of Ukraine resolution, and it supported all its BRICS partners who did exactly the same. It did not support Western sanctions against Russia. Again, at that time, it was not so noticeable because the reaction of even the West was very lukewarm because the situation was so uncertain. It was not clear which government, with what sort of government was going to emerge in Ukraine. It was not clear what the outcome of the events would be. And actually, Russia never introduced its troops on the territory of Ukraine, not immediately and not openly. What happened was that for a long time, Putin was saying that there were no Russian troops in Ukraine at all. It is only much later that he said, yes, proudly, that yes, we did have our troops there. But by then, of course, Ukraine had its referendum, and there appeared a kind of a shade of legality in what was going on. The situation in 2022 was completely different. Ukraine had a legitimately elected democratic government. It tried to defend its territorial integrity. It has tried to introduce reforms. It has tried to counter corruption, and it's tried to counter to defend basically its, I don't know what is going on here. Sorry. It tried to counter Russian intervention, even political intervention, to defend its identity as Ukraine. So the situation was completely different, but South Africa's reaction was exactly the same. The South African government disavowed the foreign ministry's original statement, which called for Russian withdrawal from Ukraine. And it stressed South African neutrality and called for the negotiated resolution of the crisis, although it was very difficult. As Elizabeth said, it was impossible to negotiate at that time. It abstained, as we know, from in the vote, General Assembly's vote on the aggression against Ukraine and on Russia's suspension from the Human Rights Council. It proposed its own resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which did not blame either Ukraine or Russia for the war. And Ramaphosa blamed NATO for the war in Ukraine and said that he would resist any calls to condemn Russia. So the situation was different. But the South African policy was still the same, neutrality. Only this time, neutrality was felt and seen as much more pro-Russian. There was an understanding that Russia really was very pleased with what South Africa was doing. There were several indications of Russia's reaction to the South African reaction to the war. The most detailed one came from the Russian International Affairs Council, which is a think tank attached to the Foreign Ministry and several other Russian ministries. Russia actually, the International Affairs Council actually praised in a very detailed way every single step that the South African government took, both its vote and its proposed resolution. It assessed the South African position as balanced or more neutral or more rational. It also said that South African government acted in a difficult situation because South African mainstream media was sharply critical of Russia's actions. And the reason for that was that it was largely and is largely controlled by Western corporations. What the Council said was that the mainstream media cannot express the real sentiments of the local population. So who in the Russian view did express the real sentiment of the local population? The collective West is for the significant element of the ANC following is presented in today's West. It is the government policy that is remembered. They do not remember that there was a very strong anti-apartheid movement and that significant portions of Western population supported anti-apartheid struggle. They also do not remember that positions of different countries varied and that also it changed over time. It's just the West that is bad in this situation, which did not help us to fight apartheid. That is how the memory works. And it is not just ideology, it is the real memory for many. For many, the struggle against apartheid was also only a part of a larger struggle against colonialism and imperialism. And that is certainly associated with the West. The very fact that Russia challenges the West makes it a representative of all the opposites: anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and a new and better world, multipolar world. And just as so many ANC cadres did not really know what socialism was, they did not know the real life under socialism. So in the same way, they do not have an idea of what this better world is going to look. A multipolar global work in Russia's terms looks more like a new Cold War situation. And this has already been mentioned as a second Cold War. This is exactly what Russian actions will result in, whether we want it or not, or whether Russia wants it or not. The collective West, headed by the United States, is paying for its long predominance in the unipolar world after the collapse of the USSR. Russia presents itself as a fighter for a new, fairer, multipolar world. Now, what I mean by the collective West and United States, first of all, are paying for their long predominance in this unipolar world. There were many mistakes which the United States or NATO or other Western countries made in their foreign policy, in their international relations during that time. It seemed that this new global order, unipolar, would last forever. And so it was permissible to intervene, and double standards were noticed it, and of course they resented it. Even partially, the Russia's move towards this anti-Westernism already starting in the late 1990s was provoked to a certain extent by the arrogance to which Russia was treated as a defeated country, whilst the Russians themselves thought that it was not defeated. Nobody defeated Russia. They defeated the order that existed in Russia, which they thought was unfair at that time. But what followed was even more difficult, and they resented being treated with contempt and arrogance, and who wouldn't? So yes, the West is paying for that arrogance, and it was obvious to me even at that time that such a moment would come. But also there are other factors which brought this situation and this attitudes among so many Africans to the present situation. One is that in the last decade, Russia dramatically increased its military presence in Africa, positioning itself as a defender of law and order and a selfless fighter against terrorism. If you think about Central African Republic, about Mali, Russia is incredibly popular there because after so many decades of war and terror and poverty. Well, poverty didn't go anywhere, but at least the order that was established in, for example, the Central African Republic, whether it is democratic or not democratic, does not worry the population. Whether it is observes human rights or doesn't observe human rights, for now, the population of the Central African Republic does not object to that order, at least not strongly. They are starting to notice, but that's a different matter altogether. Then, of course, Russia is very popular in Mali. Because it helps fight against terrorism. The Russians do not recognize that they have their troops there. They don't have the troops. They have the Wagner Group. But the Russians do not, depending on the situation, they do recognize that they have this Wagner Group or do not recognize that they have it there, or generally speaking, that such things exist. In the last decade, Russia has also improved its diplomacy and intensified its propaganda, presenting itself as a participant, if not a leader, of the new deep decolonization of the mind. This is an incredibly powerful narrative among African intellectuals and some politicians. In many African countries, not only in South Africa, but in South Africa, if we, for example, remember what Lindiwe Sisulu in her attack on the Constitution was saying, was something quite similar. Today, in the high echelons of our judicial system, these mentally colonized Africans. We have a neoliberal constitution with foreign inspirations, but were the African value system, but in this constitution, but where is the African value system in this constitution and the rule of law? If the law doesn't work for Africans in Africa, then what is the use of the rule of law? Russia has been has been making a number of clips which dissociated with any notion of colonization. One was called "Why You Should Not Why You Should Not Support United States and NATO, lure Ukraine to fight Russia." So Ukraine does not have an agency in their view. But why shouldn't you support United States and NATO? And that is because Russia has never been a colonized colonial country. It has never had colonies in Africa, it says. It has never had any African slaves. It did not participate.
Recording in progress.
It has never been a member. Mistakenly, the clip says that Russia did not participate in the Berlin Conference, which started colonization of the African continent. Some of it is true, some of it is not. But of course, nobody speaks about Russia's internal policy. Nobody speaks about Russia's policy towards its close neighbors. So that is the narrative that has been propelled, and deep decolonization has now become a kind of a catch word at many conferences which the Russians organize. Together with some African politicians and leaders. So for some, the present struggle is for decolonization of the mind. And for many South Africans, particularly within the ANC following, particularly within the AEFF following, particularly on the left, probably without any following, the anti-Western sentiment is very strong because they still are fighting for decolonization. So part of the population is decolonizing. The other part of South Africa is trying to build a different country, democratic country, which is based on the rule of law. But as we can see, even from the cabinet, that such things are not necessarily good enough for the ANC following. So this is where, in this polarized South Africa, and in this polarized I wish, by the way, that somebody did this poll and found out really what percentage of the population of South Africa is supporting South Africa's foreign policy. I think that it would be quite popular. So this is the balancing act which South Africa's government is engaged in. And this is a very important factor which defines the policy of the South African government, not just the international law, not just the constitution, not just the practical consideration. But even if we speak about practical considerations, look, I'm not an economist, I do not specialize in these things, but Just look at this tiny sample of figures. Russian, European trade, both ways, trade with South Africa actually tramples both the Russian and Ukrainian trade. But if you compare the importance of Russia for the economy and Ukraine for the South African economy, they are incomparable. Of course, Russian trade is absolutely minuscule compared to Germany's, China's, and other European countries, but still Ukrainian portion is still smaller. So although Ukraine exports very important grain for South Africa, but still Russia exports more and imports also more. In this second Cold War, what is the South Africans' priorities? Elizabeth said completely rightly, yes, this is national interest. But what does it see as a national interest? There are quite a number of things that South Africa can get out of this situation of the new Cold War. It is actually the opportune moment. There was a mysterious stately woman visit a couple of days ago, which was reported by News 24, who came on a plane which is registered in the name of Medvedev's former prime minister and former president wife. But judging by the description, she was not Svetlana Medvedeva. So she came for 2 days. What was discussed? Why did she came? Why did she come? Were there any other secret meetings like that or open meetings? After all, Putin and Ramaphosa spoke twice, which was proudly noted by the Russian International Relations Affairs Council. Maybe it can get cheap fuel. Maybe it can get cheaper grain. These are the deals which other countries are following, India, for example. Maybe it can get more vegetable oil. But also there are other opportunities which can arise, such as prospecting for Antarctic gas. There are several countries that control that area, and Russia is among them. United States, European Union, China, Russia, but Russia is the only one who, against the agreement, oral agreement, admittedly, but there was an agreement prospecting for Antarctic gas. So why can't South Africa give it a platform for that? Now, finally, of course, maybe Russia can share its experience of election technologies, so-called. That is the specific ways of winning elections. Yes, there are these opportunities, and I'm sure that some of them South African government will follow because it is in its national interests. But will the ANC and the government preserve its moral high ground? I put the question mark here because to a very large extent it depends on how the war ends, and we do not know how it ends. David was absolutely correct when he said that this is an open-end war. So maybe it will end in such a way that moral high grounds do not exist anymore, but it can end in a very different way. And then the ANC, despite the fact that its following doesn't like South African media, mainstream media, despite the fact that it doesn't accept what the West is saying, maybe the war will end in such a way that the ANC will lose this moral high ground, which it did have in the previous Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irina. That was a fascinating analysis of the relationship between South Africa and Russia and the different factions involved in determining policy. Thank you so much. We're now going to go straight through to our panel discussion. I want to ask Professor Matabule to come to the podium to lead the discussion, and Elizabeth Sideropoulos and Mark Oppenheimer to participate in the panel debate. You'll see that in front of you you have cards. If you want to ask a question, please write the question down and we'll collect them and give them to Lucky Matabule, and he'll put them to the panel.
And I have the easiest job in this conference to allow people to ask questions and allow others to answer. You know, that's a very easy job that I have. But I just want to preface my facilitation with a story in Hammanskraal. It's a place north of Pretoria. They don't have water there. And it's in a class, a mathematics class. And the mathematics teacher comes from mainstream township, Mamelodi, I would say. And Hammanskraal it's peri-urban, but more moving towards rural. Then the mathematics teacher asked a question to the kids, and he said, if there are 5 goats this side of the street, and 2 of them cross to the other side, how many goats will remain on the other side? And one of the children then said to the teacher, you first have to tell me if the 2 that jump, is there a male goat on the other 2? Then the teacher said, yes. Said, okay, nothing will remain that side because all of them are going to follow it. You get the story? Nothing will remain because all of them are going to follow it. Then he said, but what if the goat is on the other side? He said, those 2 will never jump. The moral of the story is that when we deal with things like taking sides, it depends on the context, because the child was correct. It's true. When the male goat jumps, all of them follow. And if it doesn't jump, they don't follow. So in this thing that we are dealing with today, we need to know that there are contexts that are informing certain policies. There are generations that are in charge of our government. And there's a generation that practically most of them spend time in a lot of Eastern universities, and they owe their allegiance to their degrees and what they know to the Eastern way of living. And there are some amongst them that went to the West. And potentially, if somebody does a proper analysis of the functions, you'll find that those ideological features are actually reflected in the way the ANC is finding its divisions today. And that spreads into government. Your DERCO, most of the officials in that department are from exile. Most of the leading ones are from exile. And they have that orientation of the Cold War more than, then you go to Treasury, you find boys that are trained here, you know? Your Vista University, Tekis University boys. So those are the dynamics which people don't talk about. You go to DPSA, you find your vet university trained, your PNDM boys, they are there. You go to provincial governments, you get... So you find that there are a lot of orientations in the public service that are informing one's policy or the other. If you want to know how Max Swilling is still dominant in Gauteng, you go into the departments in Gauteng, you find Max Swilling thinking is there, it's deep. You go to some departments in Pretoria, you find Tekis is dominant there. The new guy on the block, it's Masirumule from Tshwane University of Technology. He's churning a lot of doctorates out of the system, and they're moving into these senior positions. So that's the challenge about characterizing decisions of South Africa. So let me take questions. I just wanted to give you, my context is the goats in Hammanskraal, that was the child wrong to say no goat is going to cross or no goat is going to remain? And was the teacher wrong to say when 2 goats cross, out of 5, 3 remain? So both answers are correct, but it depends on what context you are doing. I just wanted us to have that, that thing without saying we must not take a side. I have a question here. They say, in a world where a values-based legal order is being challenged, do you foresee the possibility of carving a space for traditional good such as humanitarian assistance? Do I have to repeat? In a world where a value-based legal order is being challenged, do you foresee the possibility of carving a space for traditional goods such as humanitarian assistance? That's the first one. I hope you just make note. And Prof. Irene, I hope you are also listening to these questions. And I wonder, please, I hope you are listening to the questions. And the second one is, how is the, no D handwriting, it's interesting. How is the 2SP, is it 2SP? ZSP, okay? Is it the Zimbabwean Special Dispensation? Are you saying that? Yeah, Zimbabwean Special Dispensation permit. Okay, can I ask that this? I can't see well here. I have a challenge of this handwriting. Can my panelists, please, when I stop you, you must stop, so that I can allow other people to talk. And if you really think you want to ask a question from, but I don't go to allow them. I can't see this. Okay. The second one, because I want 2 questions so that you all handle 2 questions. Pro-Russian, will pro-Russian interest, pro-Russian historic and ideological interest count for more than South Africa's overwhelming trade and financial relations with the West? This is a good one. Will pro-Russian historical and ideological interest count for more than South Africa's overwhelming trade and financial relations? That's the second question. The last question, foreign policy contradicts the values enshrined in the South African Constitution. Wow, this is a statement. It starts by saying South African foreign policy contradicts the values enshrined in the South African Constitution. It's a statement that is made in the question. Then there's a question. Is it so because the Constitution is regarded by the ANC as a document written by a colonial mind? 3 questions. Can I get, who's first? Can I start with her in the virtual world? But and let me go to the cloud. Irina, are you first to start, please?
Well, I can. Look, the New World Order and the humanitarian values, I think I have mentioned that we do not know what this new global order is going to be. We really cannot judge now how and where this situation will stop. I can tell you that it is quite obvious to me that it is not going to be a very nice order. It is going to be rougher. It is going to be more selfish. I mean, each national interest would be more selfish. Each country would protect itself by more vicious and more unscrupulous means, because I do remember the previous Cold War very well, and some countries could benefit from it. But humanitarian values, yes, maybe they will still have a place in this new global order, but we don't know which order it is going to be. It all depends on that. Do you want me to speak on all 3 questions?
If you could just to give us a liner on all of them, then we allow the other panelists.
Pro-Russian historical and ideological interest, will it count more than the South African, all the South African trade? The problem is that people who decide these issues base them not necessarily on what counts more. What counts more for them? What is in their mind? It is not past ideologies. It is not for them something that was indeed history and we are just remain loyal to it. It is their way of thinking. Their way of thinking, of many of them, is that we are fighting against the global colonization. And actually, the 3rd question also goes in line with that. We are fighting against colonization because we have a colonized mind, and actually the West is still a richer world, and we don't like that. It still interferes in our affairs, and we don't like that. The trade is all very good, but if you come to the questions of these volumes of trade with the notion that you have to fight against this order, and probably you think that if you change the global order, your trade would mean much more to the West than it does now. Maybe you will benefit from that. The decolonization means much more to the mind and perceptions and sensibilities of so many people who are in government and generally speaking, quite a high proportion of South African population as far as I can see. So the same refers to the Constitution. The Constitution was written in terms of the international law, in terms of the international perceptions of the global world order, of which South Africa desperately wanted at that time to be, and wanted to be accepted on equals. If the global order changes, well, probably the constitution becomes outdated. Probably the new South Africa will not need any constitution at all. That I do not know. It's for the South Africans to see.
Okay. Wow, that's a very strong one. We probably won't need this constitution if the global order changes. Okay, let me hear your comment, even on this last statement. Can you start? Is it Lisbeth?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
I can start. Let me start with the first question around humanitarian systems, value-based legal order. I think if the case of Ukraine and the way in which humanitarianism has been allowed or not allowed to operate is any indication, it's going to become much more difficult. So you are going to have these rules and norms around humanitarianism, and the ICRC is going to be a proponent and to fight for them, but it won't necessarily be able to adhere to them or those values in certain contexts where countries like Russia can actually obstruct. And just an observation around also the points that I think Irina made also in her presentation around multipolarity. The irony is that, you know, a world that is governed or managed by one hegemon is always not a nice place for some people. But there is very clear direction. When you have a multipolar world, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be more multilateral. Okay? A more multipolar world makes multilateralism actually even more complicated. And I think this is what we're facing now. And a lot of these norms, which, you know, certainly the humanitarianism is one that shouldn't be up for question. But it is, because all of these are contested and some can flout them. I mean, that's the whole point. Some can flout and others can't. So we will probably see an inconsistent application. On the second question around the trade, the financial relations, etc. I mean, to add to that point, I suppose the critical question here is are there now immediate consequences that South Africa is facing from its European and American partners by abstaining, for example, in the 3 UN General Assembly votes? The answer is no. Might it affect relations in the future? You highlighted AGOA. I think AGOA is going to be affected, but not because of the war in Ukraine. I think AGOA is going to be affected because I think the trade environment in America has changed. It's become much more protectionist. It sees South Africa as an upper middle income country, and while AGOA might survive in other parts of the continent, it is likely that South Africa is not going to be a beneficiary, but it's not going to be because of the war in Ukraine. So there's also that element and the cost and the sort of the assessment of what the likelihood is of immediate sanctions on that. I mean, speaking to a number of European embassies, for example, the fact that South Africa has taken a position which is, you know, which hasn't been what the Europeans wanted South Africa to take, doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be a wholesale departure of European companies, of which there are many. They're very important investors in South Africa. As a result of that, they have economic interests, and you know, they've been in the country for a long time. So there's also that dimension. So yes, at one level, we should think these are our important economic partners. We should go with them. But the other side says, but they're not going to go anywhere very quickly. I mean, we see that in other contexts as well. It's very difficult when you've got direct investment to just up and leave because you disagree on a human rights principle. I mean, that's unfortunately the case. And then on the last question, I mean, that's a really depressing statement from Irina. But I think it's important to note that the Constitution was a product of the end of history narrative. It was a triumph of liberal democracy. And I hope we don't revisit it, because I think while one might say that many of these themes and thoughts may have originated in the West, they also had significant resonance in the South. In fact, the whole decolonization was about recognizing many of these rights. And I think we sometimes forget that for very short-term political expediency, and we do that at our peril, I must say. On the issue of foreign policy contradicting values, the fact of the matter is it's very difficult. There is no country in this world, and we should stop beating ourselves. There is no country in the world that follows an entirely moralistic foreign policy. It would be great if they did, but nobody does. And we're no exception. Can we do better on some of the choices that we make in terms of the trade-offs? Absolutely. Are we the exception? No, we're not. So maybe let me leave it there.
Okay, so history has not yet ended. Fukuyama is challenged by reality.
Yes.
Let's see, is it Mark?
So there's a danger in proclaiming the end of history, and I think when Francis Fukuyama came out to South Africa to speak about this, he sort of chuckles that he was wrong in thinking that we've now reached the zenith and everyone will agree. But there's also a danger in discarding the important liberal values that many have fought for and they've fought to entrench in our constitution. And there is this narrative that's alluded to that, well, the Constitution really is a document of betrayal, that it was written with a colonial mindset, that it's a sellout constitution, and really what we need to do is tear it up and have some new kind of revolutionary document. And partly why this is dangerous is that there's something so sinister with saying that freedom, dignity, and equality only belong to the West. These are values that matter for all people regardless of where they live. That it is important if you are South American or if you're African, that you want your dignity respected, that you want an equal opportunity to compete, that you want to be able to freely express your ideas and live an autonomous life. The idea that these are values for white Europeans is rather outrageous. The Constitution really is a document in some senses at odds with itself. So it does try and cater for a variety of interests. It protects multiple groups. We protect a variety of languages, at least in principle, if not in practice. And I think one of the precipices that we got very close to walking into was to remove one of the most fundamental parts of our Constitution, being the property rights section. And you can see how taking this radical line was bad for everybody. So you had a lack of investment in South Africa during that time. You see the rand dips. When we think about foreign companies that operate in South Africa, I think vested interests always take a view of, well, we're here, we've spent money, we should try and maintain a status quo. But that only tells you half the story. What about all the people that aren't investing? Those European diplomats and American diplomats that are here, want to keep the existing relationships up, but are they telling companies back home, South Africa is a wonderful place, your property rights will be respected, this is the place to invest? They aren't. We aren't seeing this new investment. We sort of cling on to the status quo. And so there's all this lost opportunity, all these jobs that could be created that we're missing out on. And part of it is because of this radical rhetoric against property rights, against liberal values, and against the Constitution. I suppose if we read Arena correctly, this idea that our Constitution will have no value in the event of nuclear World War III, I think there's something to be said for that, but I think we're nowhere near the apocalypse. What's interesting is how during the last apocalypse we had, the COVID pandemic, our Constitution played an important role. That as much as the governing party tried to erode people's rights, civil society could go to court, they could fight some of the totalitarian streaks that we found, and they could be successful in the courts. And that the reason was because we have a constitution that protects our rights. That our constitution even foresees that it will continue in states of emergency, that not all rights can be taken away. The state can't suddenly introduce summary executions, for example. There's certain rights that are foundational that can't be taken away. So even if we do have utter chaos, there's something to be said for the rule of law, and there's something to be said for clinging on to those values. On this question around aid and values, Barack Obama had an interesting line, which is that it's in America's interest to provide aid to certain parts of the world because it will lead to stability, because it's less likely to have terrorist groups coming out of countries that we assist. And so there's a sense in which you can marry these twin aims of a liberal democracy and providing aid. But aid might not be the best way of addressing global poverty. Desmond Tutu said that what you really want is freedom of trade, not just aid. And what you want is a lifting of trade barriers that South Africa can export its goods. That's a much better way of having sustainable growth in a country instead of having your hand out and asking for money from other countries, which will then necessarily come with strings. So I think creating a climate of growth is going to be more important than seeking aid from others.
Okay. I'm going to ask the last three questions, then I'm going to ask Loyalties to also come to say something. Before I ask this question, I was at one of the lodges. I like South Africa, so it has very nice nature lessons. So I was at the lodge and in Limpopo, in Varambat area. The name of the lodge is Mabalingwe. It's just a stone's throw away from the lodge that is in the news. It's a stone's throw, literally. It's a street and then there's Pala there. So I was in Mabalingwe. And as I was watching that, I saw a very beautiful springbok. Very beautiful. And when I went to the lodge and to sleep, and I was sitting there watching TV, relaxed, then I saw a National Geographic. And the lion was attacking a similar springbok. Now I was conflicted. I love the way the lion is attacking, and yet I also love the springbok. I think these are issues of foreign policy. Do you agree with me? That we might love how other countries are very aggressive in their foreign policy because the lion had an interest to get protein, and the beautiful springbok had an interest to be alive. And both those interests are important to the two species. But one depends on the other to be alive, and one depends on its speed to be alive. So in a world where there is unipolar, one big power and small guys, we run and we do that. But what South Africa has been able to successfully do over the years was to wear a beautiful mask of another lion when it was a springbok. And we started punching a little bit over our weight. And the Mandela dividend and the way our transition went, we started to believe that everything we say, people take us serious. When they took us serious when we were fighting apartheid, after apartheid, they're expecting to hear from us, but what's the value proposition are you giving to the world? And I think we have not answered that question to date. And that impacts on our foreign policy to say, what is our value proposition to the world, except liberation, rhetoric, and decoloniality? I'm going to ask these three questions and then my panelists. Do you see the chance for the military cooperation between South Africa and a Western power like AUKUS? Is it AUKUS? Or, AUKUS, yeah. A military power like AUKUS, and could this shift South African policy towards the West? Let me repeat the question to my panelists. Do you see the chance for a military cooperation between South Africa and a Western power like AUKUS? And could this shift South African policy towards the West? Second, does the panel think Russia's invasion may open the way to other invasions? Taiwan, or we here, we were a target for attack, by the way. We've got resources that can encourage some maverick willpower to want to take us over. We've got uranium and whatever. So does this thing open up for new conquests? It's a question from one of you. Prof. Arena, this one is specific to you. They say you briefly highlighted the use of social media as a way to communicate with the public. Can you expound on how we can use these platforms for our foreign policy? It doesn't mean you're excluded in answering that, but it was specifically to her. Let me take your quick responses to these three questions, and then I want to invite Loyalties. Then after that, I want to wrap up and hand over to Dave. Let me start in Joburg. I'll come back to KZN. I still have infrastructure problems to arrive there. You just said the climate change flood there. Lisbeth.
Okay, on AUKUS and South Africa, I think the point to make about South Africa's ability to engage in serious military cooperation is that certainly if anybody's been watching Parliament and the Defence Portfolio Committee discussions and the budget vote, they don't, the reality is that the Defence Force doesn't mince its words about its ability to defend the country, both in terms of its human resources as well as in terms of its hardware resources. And that affects the way in which it can do military cooperation across the board. So we did some work on this issue, looking at how South Africa engages with a number of what we call big powers on a range of sectors, and it included defense and military cooperation. And the fact is, there's very little. There are the occasional visits of ships and things like that, and there might be the occasional joint exercises, but those have become much fewer. And part of it relates to the fact that we have a defense budget that hasn't really been growing in real terms for many years. And we have an aging defense force and aging hardware as well, and things that can't take off, things that are grounded, whether it's naval resources or air resources. So that's at a capacity level in terms of any discussion about military cooperation. Now, in terms of whether the Australia, UK, US agreement, which was signed, was it earlier this year or late last year, I can't remember now, is one that South Africa might be interested in joining, and whether that would shift it more to the West. South Africa is not in the habit, in this administration, of joining military alliances of any sort. And even the exercises that have occurred with IPSAMAR are joint naval exercises, IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, but we're not in any military alliance. Clearly, South Africa has an interest in what happens in the Indian Ocean. And South Africa's interest is that it doesn't want to see a highly securitized, militarized Indian Ocean, which is which is part of the Indo-Pacific narrative, because it would rather see it in the context of its membership of the Indian Ocean Rim Association as a space for development, for economic cooperation, that kind of thing. And so I believe that South Africa needs to be looking very closely at developments like AUKUS and the broader Indo-Pacific discussions with Japan, among others. But that because it has significant implications for our maritime security, and also, however, for economic cooperation and development. And there's nothing wrong with trying to infuse that element into some of these discussions around the broader Indo-Pacific. But would it shift more to the West by engaging in military cooperation? It would not be doing military cooperation. And at least not on a formal alliance kind of level. And if you look at our armed forces at the moment, they are very much sort of modeled on Western sort of models of military doctrine and so on. It's not it's not the Chinese or the Russian. So there is a history of that, which is also just very practical. Maybe I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time. Maybe others can answer other questions because I think I've gone on for a bit.
I'll say something briefly about South Africa's military capacity. Go back in time exactly 1 year while we watched the July riots unfold and we watched shopping centers being burned to the ground, civilians being killed, no army, no police. That if you think one of the fundamental roles of the state is to protect the lives of its civilians, South Africa fails on this gigantically. The idea that it would join a Western-driven military alliance is absolutely laughable because it doesn't share the ideals and it has no capacity whatsoever. With regards to South Africa sharing its foreign policy views on social media, I think there's something quite dangerous about our politicians hanging out on Twitter. Partly because there's only so much you can say in 280 characters, that you are surrounded by large numbers of fake accounts, that it's not just a matter of broadcasting information, it's about being influenced by those that you broadcast to. And so what you have is Twitter being a very hard left space with lots of militant radical people on it, critiquing, let's say, middle of the road policy and pushing people in that direction. So I would much rather see our politicians stay off social media. What I would like to see would be our journalists growing a spine and actually being able to interrogate government positions. What you see most of the time from our journalists is repeating government lines. So if you search for the term minister says, government says, you'll see that replete in articles from the mainstream media. Throughout our president's sort of so-called family meetings, journalists played no role whatsoever. None. You had a government that eroded civilians' rights in dramatic fashions, locked them in their homes, maintained measures that the rest of the world had abandoned. No questioning from journalists because the government doesn't have that kind of relationship of reciprocity. Say what you like about Donald Trump, and there's lots to dislike about him. The guy stood there and got grilled by journalists, whereas our president didn't.
Okay. Prof?
Let me start from the end about the social media. Unfortunately, I'm a total enemy of social media. I don't use it for communication or for information or for anything else. I fully agree that it is a disaster that some of our politicians cannot get their eyes off Twitter or whatever it is. But unfortunately, to my great regret, it has become a very powerful weapon. It has become a very powerful weapon of propaganda. It has become a very powerful source of information, and people really do not have often any other source of information except Facebook or WhatsApp or TikTok or Twitter or whatever. So yes, it is a powerful weapon, and I think that any government or any propaganda tool has to learn to use it and has to try to learn. It's actually one of the reasons of the discussion between Elon Musk and Twitter. Something has to be done about the at least partial regulation of these things. But it is better for any professional person who is involved in propaganda, either a good propaganda or a bad propaganda for that matter, to master these tools, to be able to either counter them or use them. Now, there was a question about other invasions as a result of the Russian invasion, the Russian war in Ukraine. It is a double-edged sword. The experience could be so negative. It could be seen as so negative that any close invasion very soon after that probably probably China would think twice about invading Taiwan. After all, there are so many other means and ways of trying to influence the country, which actually Russia was using in Ukraine. There was no need to send the troops there because there were so many pro-Russians there. I am absolutely sure that there would be the same situation in many other countries, including Taiwan and China. So invasion, well, maybe yes or maybe no, depending again on how this war ends. And finally, about military cooperation with AUKUS, and of course, the question of capacity is very important, and the South African Army is nowhere near such an alliance. But in order to actually wish for it ideologically, the shift has to have happened already. Without a shift in mentality, in the government mentality, it would be impossible for the South African government to even think in these terms. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Let me give Tate Mwele Tsimbeki here to just make a comment, and then I will do that.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, Mrs. de Klerk. The first point I want to make is I don't think we should leave this room with the impression that there is no sympathy for the people of Ukraine from anyone in Africa. There is no one who wants to see or who is not pained by the destruction of that country that we watch every day on our television. So that I think that is a point that has to be made. Having said that, I think we should give the ambassador, if she wants to, an opportunity to talk to us. I know that certainly very prominent 20th century diplomats like Henry Kissinger advised Ukraine against being involved in the conflict between the West and Russia. But we have not heard what the Ukrainians themselves think of what Henry Kissinger had to say. So if this is possible, Mr. Chairman, I think we should give the ambassador the opportunity to explain to us their point of view of how they see their situation. The second point I want to make is that, again, to the ambassador to communicate to her people. Russia, for us in the third world, for us in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, has been a supporter. The Russians supported the Boers during their war against the English, against England, during the Anglo-Boer War between 1899 and 1902. The Russians supported them. With our own conflicts between the African people and the whites, the Russians supported the African people. Remember, the only part of the world where nuclear weapons have been used has been outside Europe. It was in Asia, in Japan. So countries in Africa, in Asia, are afraid of the West. And what did Russia do? The one country that most feared being attacked with nuclear weapons was China, especially after the 1949 establishment of the People's Republic of China. It was Russia that showed the Chinese how to make nuclear weapons to defend themselves. So it is very important for the people of Ukraine to understand the relationship between Russia and the rest of the non-Western world. That Russia has been supporting the non-Western world against 500 years of pillage, destruction. The destruction you see in Ukraine is very sad, but the slaughter of the Native Americans is not talked about. The slaughter of the San people, the slaughter of the Herero people. This is what the West has been doing to the non-Western world. So yes, we don't want to see this happening to Ukraine, but you have to understand it has been happening to the rest of us for the last 500 years. The last point, Mr. Chairman, I want to make, you have to understand that we are divided in South Africa. There were those who worked with the British against the Boers and against the Zulus and against the other native populations. The English-speaking white South African population obviously was collaborating with the British in their control and defeat of the native peoples in South Africa. So they do not share the views of the rest of us who benefited from support from the Russians. But you have to understand that is their view, it's not the view of a large number of people in South Africa. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Can I ask the ambassador to come through and let's get that perspective. I know we also had somebody from the Taiwan, but I don't see him here. But let's only allow the ambassador just to give us a comment in that context. I think Moeletsi gave us a good context on that. It's the context of the mathematics problem in Hammanskraal. You remember?
Almost.
Almost. Thank you.
Almost, because so many times I heard today that we have to understand, so I definitely have to make my comment. First of all, thank you for both funds and organizations for organizing this very important discussion, and for our panelists to expressing their views and perspectives. I think it was a really meaningful and important conversation where everyone from us will take something back home. It would take us quite a lot of time to hear Ukrainian perspective, and I would suggest that we could organize the next meeting, including representatives of Ukraine and myself. I am always available for that. Meantime, let me reflect to what just was said. Again, we heard from one of panelists today that narrative that reflects the thinking of some part of South African society that Russia helped South Africans and Africa to fight against colonialism, against apartheid, while we are not hearing another part of the story, that this is the perception which was imposing by Russia already for 30 years on African countries. It was not Russia, it was USSR. It is 15 countries, I must apologize. And a lot of, particularly South Africans, were studying in Ukraine, in Ukrainian Soviet Republic, that republic who put its signature under the Charter of the United Nations. Not even Russia did so. And when we speak about more deeper history and going back to Anglo-Boer War, I must say that Ukraine already existed at that time for 10 centuries. And even Ukrainians were fighting in that war. I don't know if it's a popular thing to know and whether it's approved documentally, but even Winston Churchill was liberated by Ukrainian soldier during the war. Who did know this? Well, I think that the aspect of nuclear power and nuclear threats today, it's a very important one for us to discuss, Ukraine and South Africa particularly. Why this crisis, why this war is different from all other wars that we have today and conflicts? Because one nuclear power is attacking and invading non-nuclear power. But that one who abandoned its nuclear weapons for the guarantees of aggressor, and not only. So there were 3 countries that guaranteed Ukraine its sovereignty and territorial integrity when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, as South Africa did a long time ago. United States, Great Britain, and Russia. That's why we have to clearly understand that world today is becoming not the safe place, because no one is following the international law and the agreements that the countries are binding to. Guess the number: more than 400 bilateral and international agreements to which Russia and Ukraine are assigned to, were violated by Russia since 2014. Then the narrative about how Russia was supported non-Western world. It's very well known in most of African countries, and being Africanist by profession, I must tell you that it is very dangerous today to divide non-Western and Western world. Why we should be very cautious? Because the world is very global and becoming more and more economically dependent. And when you look at what is not only trade between Western countries and Africa, but also the support from the countries which you say Western, but they're just richer than the rest of the world for now. When you see the support that is coming to these non-European countries from European countries, then it makes sense that the lessons of history were taken, whether we should refer to the long history and blame each other for the mistakes being made, or we should adhere to the global values, to the values of democracy, for which particularly African continent were fighting and losing the life of Africans. This would be my question, which I would you to go out from this room today. And of course, we all remember the history, and we remember how much pain the continent had. And we remember the Herero tribe and those atrocities, genocide that was happening. Why should we today, in the 21st century, allow the genocide to repeat itself? Because if it repeats today in Ukraine, it will repeat anywhere in the world, and Africa will not be an exclusion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. As they say, human rights, the context of human rights is always current and not historical. That's the challenge about human rights. The context of human rights is always current. They are demanded as they are violated at the time they are violated. And once you get historical about them, it becomes difficult to look at what violations are happening now. And that's the challenge that we have with our history. But thank you for enlightening us. The dimension of the USSR and Russia, it's something that we have factorized the set that supported us. That we might have been supported by the Polish, there was the whole USSR. We have just factorized it, but it's important that the embassy becomes aggressive in making sure that that information goes out. What Loyalties said, it's also my perception about the Russia, not USSR, especially the story about the Anglo-Boer War, because at that time it was before the 1917 revolution. So in our mind, it's the Russians that were here, not the USSR. So just work it so that people know. And South Africans are very good. When they have information, they react to information. That's why our media sometimes abuses us, because we do read what we don't like, even if they write. Even if we don't like what they write, we read it to tell them that we don't like it. But we read it. We don't ignore it. So if you put that information, it will be read, there will be responses. Thank you, Dave, and the team for selecting me to facilitate this. I really enjoyed the session. We late for lunch, but I wanted to share with you the last thing that Clem Santa, there's a book that Clem Santa wrote on the foxes. And when he opens that book, I think it's in the preface or in the first chapter or what, he says in Africa, when in the African bush, when you wake up, there's a lion that wakes up, is going to hunt for food. And there's a gazelle that wakes up and it knows that it is hunted. So in Africa, you have to choose whether you are the hunted or you are the hunter. That is what he introduces in his book, is it what, The Way of the Foxes? There's a book Clem Santa wrote, Foxes and the Hedgehogs, yes. He introduces that way, and I think the world is becoming that forest, where there are those that are hunted and those that are hunting. And we need to say, as humanity in the world, how do we stop humanity hunting humanity for no reason? Thank you. Dave, you can come through. Elita, thank you for allowing me to facilitate here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucky. And I'd like to ask our Vice Chairperson, Elita de Klerk, just to close the conference. And thank you to our panelists. That was a great discussion.
So my job here is to wrap up things. I must say it was a privilege to get to know the Ambassador Abravitova. Thank you, and thank you to the amazing speakers. And I must say, Mark Oppenheimer said something Looking at the people is wonderful. Looking and listening to the people. Thank you so much. You all gave amazing speeches. And I must say, this is our first outing since FW's passing. And I think we did relatively well. We have freedom of speech, and this freedom of speech, we owe it to our Constitution. We are free to express our ideas following the constitutional dispensation in the development of South Africa, managing an inclusive society. Compromise and tolerance are essential if peace is to be achieved. Diplomacy is civility. It is more than good manners. It is the recognition that violent speech leads to violent deeds. Finally, in the war in Ukraine, Putin threatens catastrophic consequences for world energy markets if Western powers impose sanctions on Moscow. Let's truly hope for an end for this war in the near future. And then I want to finish with something which I hope Mr. Putin will listen. When the power of love overcomes the power of power, the world will know peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Alita. And we'd now like to invite you to join us for a light lunch. Thank you very much to the organizers. Thanks to the technical team. Thanks to our wonderful panel and speakers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.